Welcome back to Global Money Talk live from the New York Stock Exchange. The capital goods sector, also known as the industrial sector, includes companies that manufacture or distribute goods. The diverse sector also covers machinery, electrical equipment, aerospace, defense, engineering, as well as construction. Now, the sector's performance is sensitive to the economy and tends to do well when the economy is growing, but demand tends to drop and prices tend to fall when economic conditions worsen. Meanwhile, the steel industry is known for being cyclical and reflective of overall market conditions. Joining me for today's market insight here at the New York Stock Exchange is Richard Bayles, partner at Karani Asset Management. So, Richard, thank you so much for joining me and welcome back.
Nice to see you.
Well, last time you were here, we were talking about the steel industry, and there has been a lot of noise surrounding cyclical stocks. But how has the industry dealt with the commodity nature of the products that it sells?
Well, one way is they can't get away from the commodity nature of the business. And so almost any commodity, steel, paper, oil and gas, they can't do much about the product. There are different classifications. You can improve the quality, but then you'll compete with somebody else's high-quality product. What you really need to do is control your costs. If you have a large market and low costs, you can do rather well, even with some cyclicality. But there are measures they take. For example, they try to integrate forward into products that might have a higher margin. The problem with that is when the demand for steel is low, the demand for the steel products is low, and so you get hit with both. But if you can make the products better than somebody else, you can avoid some of the cyclicality. Essentially, however, there isn't much to be done about it except lower your costs rather ruthlessly. The history of the steel business, the little bit I know of it, illustrates this well. Andrew Carnegie became a rich man by investing at the bottom and being really tough on his competitors. As a result, he had lower costs and lower costs and lower costs, and that allowed him to get bigger. Bigger plants, they're really simply large machines. Bigger plants were more efficient. But they had to keep running, and they had to go even when there was an oversupplied market. And what that meant was that the prices were worse. When you need to sell your product, and you can't sell it on features, and you can't sell it on delivery time, and you can't sell it on any other thing, you simply lower the price. And so prices would be much more volatile than output. Okay. Steel is a difficult thing to make, or was a difficult thing to make. Coal, coking coal, iron ore, burn them together, and then refine them, and then shape them into products. That was the way for decades and decades, from the 19th century on up into the middle and beyond of the 20th century. But the only way to deal with the problems was lower your cost.
And now that we've touched upon the steel industry, I do want to move on to industrials. So when it comes to industrials as well as capital goods, that's another highly cyclical industry there. So when it comes to cyclicality of industrials, give us an idea of what we're talking about here.
Well, again, even industrial products that can change, that can develop new products, sell something that's more efficient for their customers, they do have to deal with the fact that they have a lot of fixed costs to cover, and they need to cover those all the time. Otherwise, there's a substantial deficit, and it has to be made up, and that comes out of the owner's pockets. The best thing you can do is make your product more worthwhile to the customer than the next person's product. I'll give you an example. There's a Swedish company called Atlas Copco. They have been the Copco stands for compressor company. They've been making compressors for 100 years. 100 years of compressor making has improved and improved and improved the design of the product, because the only way you're going to sell your product instead of somebody else's is not so much the price. You're both got largely the same costs. You can't really get to be much lower cost, but that your product does better things. Switch. Think of a cupcake factory. How do you get the cupcakes moving? How do you move them? They're on a conveyor belt, but you got to move them aside. How do they do that? A puff of air. Where does the air come from? It comes from a compressor. Whose idea was that? Was it the baker that figured out, I can take a compressor and move the product? No, it was a compressor manufacturer who said, look what I can do for you. So the more of that kind of thing that went on, the more and more value could be created by a compressor manufacturer. There's another element of cost that affects everybody, and that's labor cost. If you go back to the steel business, 200 years ago, well, not quite, 150 years ago, the average steel maker, average steel worker in a steel plant worked a 12-hour shift. My gosh, a 12-hour shift. It's hot, it's dirty, it's dangerous. You can fall into a molten steel. You can have somebody swing something, hit you in the head. How do you make that cost low? What they thought at the time was you just keep using the workers the way you're using the equipment. Turns out workers aren't the same as equipment. They get tired. They get grumpy, they get cranky, they get hurt. So somewhere in the middle of the later part of the 19th century, there's a manager who took over for one of Carnegie's steel plants, and he decided we're not going to have 12-hour shifts, we're going to have 3 8-hour shifts. Everybody gets the same money for the 8 hours they got for the 12, but now we'll have people who are rested, they're not angry with each other, they're not in as much danger because they're alert. And productivity went way up, and they produced way more steel. So that didn't catch on at the time, but it's clearly something that modern corporations understand, or we hope they do.
Because when we think about how labor conditions were not just in the previous century but 150 years ago, they're significantly different. It's quite a different landscape here.
Yeah, look, if you are competing to lower your cost and get an advantage, you will try as many different things as you can. And some of them may end up abusing the labor force as opposed to protecting it and incorporating it in what you do. A wonderful example, Costco is incredibly efficient in all of their warehouses, and they pay the highest amount of anybody in the warehouse/retailing business, and they provide the most generous health care benefits. What do they get? They get the lowest turnover in the industry. They get long-term employment. If I've been doing the same job every year for 20 years, I'm probably going to be a lot better at it, more efficient, higher output than the person we hire this week to start their career. So one of the elements of cost control is labor relations. And the companies that have the best labor relations, whose employees feel that they are treated well, they're safe, and they're respected, do the best. I think actually the most important of those three is the respect part.
Yes, I do have to agree with you, because when we think about the costs that might be associated with hiring as well as other training costs, it is better to retain and maintain a better culture, and that is something that we don't hear much about in this modern day and age, especially when it comes to the labor market. And we are seeing strikes, whether we're talking about port strikes or other industries as well. So perhaps a history lesson for some of these executives might be in order. But I do want to take a look at capital goods industries, in particular companies. So we know that they do tend to have a multiplier effect on the economy here. So when it comes to performance, given that they're sensitive to fluctuations in the business cycle, in your experience, what do you think makes for a good company in this space?
Let's take a really terrific example. Yesterday, I think a company called ASML, which is in Holland, and makes the enormous machines. I think it takes 6 airplanes to move them from where they're made to where they're used. 747s. They announced that they're going to have a slightly, or not so slightly, less good outlook. Stock went down 15%. It's down again today, I believe. The fear of cyclicality. Oh my gosh, it won't be as good as we thought it would be. How does a shareholder overcome that? A shareholder can't overcome the daily, weekly, even quarterly fluctuations for things they may not know about, that didn't consider or weren't informed about. They were told, my gosh, the outlook is great, and now the outlook isn't, and you didn't have much warning. Take a long-term perspective. If you'd owned ASML for the last 6 or 8 years, you care about the 15%, but it hasn't really hurt your returns. And so, from a shareholder's point of view, a very long perspective is probably the best defense against the cyclicality. And generally speaking, there will be times when people will get disgusted with, oh my gosh, it's too volatile, I couldn't tell what was coming, and sell it to you at a cheaper price. So when you start with a cheap price and hold for a long time in a successful business, you'll do fine.
And when we're talking about cyclicality, just for our viewing audience, can you clarify what we're talking about here in terms of years?
Oh, if we only knew. If you take the last cycle, the cycle we either the cycle we may be in, that cycle very well could be the longest we've ever been in. The only pause we had was over COVID, and if you want to say, I get a timeout for COVID, nobody could have known that that was going to slow things down. Then the economy's been expanding in the United States and elsewhere since the mid-teens. Before that, it was 4 or 5 years. I have a good friend who says, we're in a wonderful business. The economy and the markets go up 4 out of 5 years. So 4 out of 5 years is pretty good. It's better than a great average in baseball. So cyclicality is part of what we live with. It comes from the nature of fixed costs and is more exaggerated for those that have higher fixed costs. So to go back to what do companies do to try to ameliorate things? One way to ameliorate the cyclicality is to not make very much. Assemble rather than make. So go back to Atlas Copco. They buy the screws and the steel parts that make a compressor, and then they assemble those. If you assemble, somebody else is taking that piece of fixed cost away from you. There's a company we have an interest in called Rational. It makes what are called combi steamers, capital goods for the restaurant business. So they are cookers that provide steam and convection and electronic microwave heat, all in the same piece of equipment. And that piece of equipment allows a restaurant to make more things simultaneously than they can do with standard equipment. It saves a lot of money, saves space, and so on. But what's important about Rational is they don't make anything much. They buy their semiconductors, they buy stainless steel cabinets, they buy all of the nozzles, they buy all of the hoses. And so one person assembles a piece of equipment and then stamps his name on it, which is a bit of extra pride and respect that's really quite important. Again, respect is a powerful thing.
And Richard, I do want to ask you about incentives when it comes to this industry. So can you tell us more about incentives as one of the key differentiators of what makes these great companies?
Incentives are really hard. Charlie Munger once said, "Show me your incentives and I'll show you the output." You can really screw them up. A few years ago, Wells Fargo decided we should have more of our customers own more credit cards. So they put in a set of incentives that got people to get the customers to buy more, to get more credit cards. What they got was a lot of inappropriate purchases of credit cards, people who didn't know what they had bought, and a whole snafu that really ended up damaging customer relations. So be careful as to what you ask for. One of the things that is really helpful is getting to this question of respect. I think people, there's a TED Talk by a guy by the name of Pete Stavros. He's a leader at KKR. I was about to say partner, but it's not quite the same thing. He's a leader at KKR of their private equity. He's done a TED Talk on how they provide the financial incentives for a company that they have bought. Everybody gets a stock certificate. Everybody gets some an interest in the business, along with KKR and KKR's investors. So when that business is sold, it can be transforming. More important, or at least as important, is that when people know they have a share of the business, they behave differently, they think differently. One anecdote is from a company called Overhead Door, which is in the TED Talk and they use broadly. It's a driver. Guy, the Overhead Doors plants in north central Illinois. So they're delivering garage doors around the upper Midwest. And the guy's driving the truck. And he's got to go to Minnesota and Wisconsin. And on one trip, he had to go up to Door County, which is in the northern part of Wisconsin, way out of his way. And he said to the people in the business, "Listen, if I were still working and earning my pay by miles driven, I wouldn't tell you this. But I know that we don't make any money paying me to deliver that door up in Door County. It's too far, it's too expensive, it's got to be destroying our profitability. Figure out a different schedule." I think that's the kind of thing you get when you engage people, engage their financial interest, and get them to think about where they are working and how they can contribute. But the principal idea, I believe, is that it's respect.
Well, you do highlight both the risks as well as rewards when it comes to incentives. And I'm really curious, Richard, so what ended up happening with this company that you just mentioned in terms of what they ended up doing?
Well, they got sold. I can't remember, but I believe KKR owned them for 6 or 8 years. Mm-hmm. And KKR bought them from another private equity firm. But because of the reorganization they'd been able to do, the rethinking of it, they sold the business, actually, to Nucor, the steel company. Think about it. You make an overhead door with rails of steel, and so it fits a bit with Nucor's attempt to move downstream and to integrate into the products rather than just not simply the steel. And it was a very successful purchase for all of the people who worked there. They got to pay off their home mortgage. They got to send their kids to college. They got to do a lot of things that in a different environment with a different kind of deal, they're only a modest percentage of the total value, but it was huge value to the people who worked there. And as I say, I think they created a great deal of that value because of their ability to have input into the business.
And you have highlighted some of the rewards that come with incentives, but do you have any examples of misplaced incentives?
Well, the Wells Fargo one is famous. The problem of the stevedore strike that just was raised, it just ended. Who's going to pay for the obvious automation that's going to come? If I'm the owner of the shipping business and I try to put it all off on the workers, I'm really going to be troubled. So I'm going to have to make a deal where some of the value that will come from replacing the people with robots goes to the people who are replaced. I'm not going to be able to figure that out, but lots of people are. Different example. Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, or merged with McDonnell Douglas. And Boeing's in such difficulty now that it's easy to point fingers and say how badly they were managed. But there was one thing early on that they did. Boeing doesn't sell airplanes. Boeing sells air safety. If their planes don't work, or if they crash, nobody's going to ride in them, and if nobody rides in them, none of the airlines is going to buy them, no matter what the price is. So air safety is not a commodity, it's a requirement. Shortly after the McDonnell Douglas merger, Boeing moved its headquarters, the executives, out of Seattle and away from the production. So what a business that was built on the marriage of engineering and construction and management, suddenly one of those pieces wasn't there. Oh, you guys figure it out. We've got better things to do. Probably led to some shortfalls, corner cutting and other problems that have put Boeing in the place where they now have to raise some capital because they've not done what the business had been doing for decades.
And that brings me to my next question. So you brought up the example of Boeing, and we're seeing this right now being played out in terms of negotiations and the new chief executive officer. One thing that I've noticed that you've mentioned is respect, and that is a key word. And I wonder, just based on your observations of companies, not just in industrials, but also other sectors as well, what has happened in the past several years when it comes to corporate culture, when we think about Milton Friedman, for example, and what he said about corporations and what the responsibility is of an organization? What is your take, just based on observations of corporations in this day and age?
What I think Milton Friedman said was the social purpose for a business is to make a profit. Well, that's fine. And I don't see how you can disagree with that. How do you make your profit? Do you make your profit in 1 year and then the hell with what happens later because you've been able to squeeze everybody and squeeze everything and get away with a lot? No, of course not. You have to remember that a corporation is meant to be immortal, or at least very long-lived. And how is it going to be that? It's going to be that when the employees and the management work together. Are they going to work together if I cut your if I cut your health insurance to save money so that I make my quarterly number? The quarterly number becomes a lot more important than not just my insurance, but my child's broken leg. That's not respect. That's not what this is all about. The best profit, the most profitable companies tend to be those that have not just labor peace or cooperation, but input. We ought to do this. We can do that. Think of that driver who isn't gonna, who says, don't send me up there to deliver that door. It's not profitable. Let's figure out something else. When you have a company doing that, the returns on assets, the cash flow, and all of those things go way up. You can listen to the Milton Friedman idea and say, well, that's meant to just coddle the workers. It's not coddling at all. It's cooperation. It's respecting each other. If the people working in your company think you're a jerk, they're probably not going to work as hard as if they think you're really smart. I'm going to tell, there's an example of that. Hewlett-Packard was one of the most successful, still is a reasonably successful business. But for decades, from the garage in Palo Alto into the 90s, it was really successful. Why? Everybody who worked there thought they had a personal story with either Bill or Dave. Dave Packard, Bill Hewitt. They knew them. They trusted them. They had seen them working on engineering problems. More to the point, there are lots of things that Hewlett-Packard did to run the business well. One of them was they bought a large tract of land in Northern California, and anybody who worked at Hewlett-Packard could go camping there, could take their family there. It was a huge and unique perk. Didn't cost them a lot of money, but it was rooted in the sense of, come on guys, we can all camp together. Hewlett and Packard retired. They were replaced by pretty good company executives, but they weren't Bill and Dave, and they didn't have that connection, and they didn't figure out how to make it happen. So.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to how we live in different times, and there tends to be so much focus on innovation when it comes to technology, but not so much when it comes to corporate culture. And we know when we're talking about the example of Milton Friedman that the Business Roundtable has updated their statement regarding corporate social responsibility. Right. But I think it would be great for us to round up today's discussion on industrials by talking about where you see opportunities in industrials and the capital goods sector, especially when it comes to that key term you mentioned, which is respect and, of course, trust, because it's easier to say than to actually build here.
Okay. Well, I mentioned Atlas Copco. Let me tell you a couple of things about them as well. Every job except CFO and CEO, I believe, is posted within the company, all the managerial work. So if you say, geez, you know, I might like to live in India and I can do this job and it just came up, you're free to apply for it. That means that everybody gets some chance, some chance to say where they want to work, how they want to work, what they'd like to do. They don't have to go outside the company to explore a new idea. They can keep their experience within. The business is enormously decentralized. The people in headquarters essentially allocate capital and very little else. So all of the business problems, all of the new designs for products, how are we going to get to market? How much are we going to do in terms of sales? How are we going to develop our service business? That, by the way, is one of the ways a cyclical company tries to ameliorate its business. They sell parts and service throughout time. it's helpful. It's quite helpful sometimes. It does soften the blow of a decline in economic activity. But it isn't perfect, because when they're not using your product, they're not wearing it out and they're not replacing it. Nevertheless, if you take this kind of openness and decentralization, you get not just one set of people doing R&D and study, you get the company doing that, and it's a very big help. So Atlas has a broad, diverse capital goods program. They have a orderly, marvelous transition in the leadership. We've owned it for several years, and I think we've seen 4 CEOs. I joked to somebody, they all looked alike. But the most recent guy is not from Sweden, he's from Brazil. So he doesn't quite look alike, but they all do look alike. They're running the business by this same sort of open book kind of way. And down in the business units, people are working for their unit, for their company, their colleagues, and they create that kind of mutuality.
Well, Richard, we are all out of time for today. Thank you so much for weighing in on the steel industry as well as industrials. It was very interesting to hear your perspective and very insightful as well. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure. And that will do it for Global Money Talk, live from the New York Stock Exchange. We're so excited to bring you daily coverage here on Sampro TV. You can check out the show anytime on our YouTube channel by searching Global Money Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow morning. Have a wonderful day.